Shutterstock explore deep in the industrial heart of urban Siberia, where the skyline is dominated by steel chimneys and the air carries the scent of frozen metal. A medical revolution was born in the shadows of the Soviet era. While the rest of the world looked toward expensive pharmaceuticals, one man looked toward the very breath of life itself. Welcome to Novosibirsk, 1952. Behind the closed doors of a high-security laboratory, a young doctor made a discovery so radical it was immediately suppressed by the medical establishment. He didn't find a new drug. He found a fundamental flaw in how humans breathe. A flaw he claimed was the root of incurable asthma, hypertension, and chronic fatigue. Before we dive into the mystery of the man who cured the impossible, using nothing but the air in our lungs, I want to see how far this story is reaching. Drop a comment below and let us know which city or country you are watching from right now. Stay tuned, because what you're about to see isn't just history, it's a breathing hack that could change your life today. The story begins not in a hut, but in the sterile, high-pressure environment of the Novosibirsk Medical Institute, where Dr. Konstantin Buteyko sat surrounded by the humming machinery of a modern Soviet hospital. As a top-tier clinical researcher, Buteyko was tasked with monitoring the vitals of terminally ill patients, a job that required him to spend thousands of hours observing the rhythmic rise and fall of chests in the respiratory ward. He noticed a haunting pattern. As a patient's condition worsened, their breathing became deeper and more labored, a phenomenon the medical textbooks of the time described as a compensatory mechanism. However, Buteyko began to suspect the reverse, that the heavy breathing wasn't a symptom of the dying process, but the actual cause of the physiological collapse. In a moment of radical intuition, he wondered if the overbreathing or hyperventilation seen in urban workers was actually starving their cells of oxygen rather than providing it. This paradoxical thought went against every established medical grain of the 20th century, setting him on a collision course with the powerful bureaucrats of the USSR's health ministry. To test his theory, Buteyko turned the lens on himself, a move of desperate scientific bravado that would define his legacy in the annals of alternative medicine. At the time, he was suffering from malignant hypertension, a death sentence in the 1950s, with a blood pressure so high his head throbbed in synchronization with his heartbeat. Standing by a window overlooking the gray, industrial expanse of the Siberian city, he decided to deliberately restrict his airflow, taking shallow, light breaths through his nose instead of the deep gasps he had been taught were healthy. Within minutes, the pounding in his temples ceased, and the excruciating pain that had plagued him for months simply evaporated into the cold Siberian air. He repeated the experiment, intentionally breathing deeply until the pain returned, and then silencing it again with light nasal breathing. He had discovered a biological volume knob for human health, realizing that the urban stress of the city was forcing people into a state of permanent respiratory excess that was slowly poisoning their internal chemistry. The innovation was centered on a scientific principle that modern medicine often overlooked, the Bohr Effect, which dictates how oxygen is released from the blood into the tissues. Buteyko realized that by breathing too much, patients were flushing out their carbon dioxide, $CO_2, and without enough $CO_2 in the blood, the oxygen became trapped in the hemoglobin, unable to reach the brain, heart, or muscles. In the high-stress, polluted environment of urban Siberia, residents were subconsciously overbreathing to cope with anxiety, unknowingly suffocating their cells in a sea of oxygen-rich blood that refused to let go of its cargo. He called his method the voluntary elimination of deep breathing, VDB, a technical system designed to recalibrate the body's respiratory center in the brain. He began applying this to impossible cases in the city hospital. Men and women with chronic asthma who were dependent on primitive inhalers and steroid treatments that barely kept them alive. To the shock of the nursing staff, patients who practiced Buteyko's quiet breathing were walking out of the wards within days, their lungs clear and their reliance on medication vanished. The breakthrough reached its peak when Buteyko was granted a secret laboratory in the elite science city of Akademgorodok, a hub for the brightest minds in the Soviet Union. Here, away from the prying eyes of the traditional medical unions, he treated the urban elite and high-ranking officials who had failed to find relief in Moscow's best clinics. His impossible cure involved training the body to tolerate higher levels of $CO_2, which acted as a natural vasodilator, opening up the airways and blood vessels instantaneously. Word spread through the concrete corridors of the city that a Siberian wizard was curing the incurable without a single pill or injection. However, this success was a double-edged sword. The Soviet pharmaceutical industry viewed his zero-cost cure as a direct threat to their production quotas. Despite the undeniable data showing a 90% success rate in treating respiratory ailments, The medical board labeled him a charlatan, and his laboratory was raided, his equipment smashed, and his research buried under a mountain of red tape. But the Siberian doctor would not be silenced by the cold hand of Soviet censorship, and his method moved into the underground Samizdat networks of the city. People met in dimly lit apartments in Novosibirsk to learn the secret of the pause, the practice of holding one's breath after an exhale to reset the nervous system. This wasn't just about breathing, it was a form of biological resistance against the industrial grind that was making the urban population sick. Families who had suffered for generations from hereditary allergies found that by simply changing how they utilized the air in their cramped city flats, they could achieve a level of vitality they hadn't known since childhood. Buteyko's innovation proved that the most powerful medicine wasn't something you bought, but something you managed within your own ribcage. Today, his legacy lives on in specialized clinics worldwide, a testament to the man who looked at the impossible and realized the solution was as thin and invisible as the air we breathe. As the 1960s rolled into the 70s, the urban landscape of Siberia became a living laboratory for Buteyko's increasingly complex theories on cellular respiration. He began to notice that the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union was creating a hidden epidemic of hyperventilation, driven by the frantic pace of factory work and the cramped conditions of high-rise apartment living. He argued that the modern human was effectively allergic to the air because they were consuming it in quantities the body wasn't evolved to handle. In his secret clinics, he moved beyond asthma, beginning to treat patients with skin disorders, digestive issues, and even psychological trauma, asserting that the stabilization of blood gases was the foundation of all metabolic health. He developed a controlled pause test, a simple diagnostic where a patient held their breath after a normal exhale to measure their internal oxygenation levels. If a city dweller couldn't last 40 seconds, Buteyko considered them severely compromised, regardless of how healthy they looked on the outside. The tension between Buteyko and the state reached a boiling point when he successfully treated the wife of a high-ranking Kremlin official who had been flown to Siberia as a last resort. Her impossible recovery from a debilitating heart condition forced the Soviet Academy of Sciences to take a second look, but instead of praise, Buteyko was met with intense jealousy from his peers. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that something as complex as cardiovascular disease could be mitigated by not breathing. They demanded rigorous, near-impossible double-blind studies in an era where such things were rarely applied to state-sponsored drugs. Buteyko, ever the defiant Siberian, responded by taking on the most hopeless cases in the city's pediatric wards, teaching children with severe developmental delays and respiratory distress how to breathe like a sleeping cat, quiet, invisible, and efficient. The sight of children who had spent their lives gasping for air suddenly playing calmly in the hospital gardens became a powerful, albeit unauthorized, advertisement for his work. Beyond the physiological, Buteyko's methods began to take on a philosophical edge within the urban intellectual circles of Novosibirsk. He suggested that the overbreathing of the modern man was a symptom of a deeper spiritual and psychological unrest, a frantic attempt to consume more of the world than necessary. In the crowded buses and bustling marketplaces of the city, he saw a population in a state of constant air hunger, which he linked to the rising rates of anxiety and aggression. By teaching people to reduce their breathing, he was essentially teaching them how to reclaim their calm in the middle of a concrete jungle. This Siberian Zen became a whispered secret among the city's artists and scientists, who found that the method didn't just cure their physical ailments but sharpened their focus and increased their creative output. The doctor had moved from being a mere clinician to a sort of urban shaman, using the laws of biochemistry to fight the dehumanizing effects of the industrial age. The 1980s finally brought a sliver of official recognition as the Soviet Union began to crumble and the glasnost era allowed for suppressed ideas to surface. A formal trial of the Buteyko method was conducted at the first Moscow Children's Hospital, and the results were so staggering, showing a near 100% success rate for asthma relief, that the Ministry of Health was forced to officially approve the method for nationwide use. However, the victory was bittersweet for Buteyko. Decades of persecution had left him wary of the establishment. He watched as his life's work was distilled into simplified versions that lost the depth of his original Siberian insights. He remained in the urban north, continuing to refine his impossible cures, eventually turning his attention to the burgeoning field of space medicine, suggesting that cosmonauts would need to master their breathing to survive the rigors of long-term orbit, further cementing his reputation as a man decades ahead of his time. In the final years of his life, Buteyko became a legendary figure in the streets of Novosibirsk, often seen walking through the city parks, a man of modest stature but immense presence. He warned that the 21st century would bring even greater respiratory challenges as air quality declined and digital stress increased, predicting a world where quiet breathing would become a lost art. His death in 2003 didn't end the story. Instead, it sparked a global movement. From the skyscrapers of London to the tech hubs of Silicon Valley, the Siberian doctor's unconventional methods are being rediscovered by a new generation of biohackers and health seekers. They are finding that in an age of more is better, the secret to curing the impossible might just be less air, more balance, and the courage to challenge the status quo. The gray, frozen streets of Siberia may have been the birthplace of this revolution, but its destination is every human heart seeking to beat a little more calmly in a chaotic world. The technical depth of Buteyko's discovery relied on understanding that the modern urban diet, heavy in processed sugars and proteins, was also a major contributor to overbreathing. He observed that the citizens of Novosibirsk who consumed traditional, simpler diets had a more stable respiratory drive than those indulging in the new modern luxuries. This led him to integrate nutritional advice into his breathing protocols, creating a holistic urban survival kit for the body. He argued that every bite of food and every breath of air were interconnected in a complex dance of pH levels and electrolytes. To Buteyko, the impossible illnesses weren't random strokes of bad luck. They were logical outcomes of a system out of equilibrium. He proved this by taking groups of chronic patients into the high-altitude regions of the Altai Mountains, showing them that their bodies could thrive on less, provided they knew how to manage their internal chemistry through disciplined, shallow breathing. One of the most captivating stories from the peak of his career involved a prominent Siberian opera singer whose career was cut short by incurable vocal cord nodules and chronic bronchitis. The city's best specialists told her she would never sing again, as her lungs were too weak to support the operatic power required for the stage. Buteyko took her under his wing, not by treating her throat, but by taping her mouth shut during sleep to force nasal breathing and retraining her diaphragm to move with minimal effort. Within 3 months, the nodules disappeared, a feat medical science deemed impossible without surgery. She returned to the stage of the Novosibirsk Opera and Ballet Theater, her voice clearer and more resonant than ever before. This miracle was witnessed by hundreds of the city's elite, turning the Buteyko method from a fringe theory into a cultural phenomenon that challenged the very definition of surgical necessity in Soviet medicine. Despite the fame, Buteyko faced a dark period when the state attempted to weaponize his research for military applications, specifically for enhancing the endurance of Spetsnaz units in extreme environments. He was reportedly pressured to turn his healing method into a performance method, stripped of its compassionate roots. Buteyko resisted, maintaining that his work was for the sick and the suffering, not for creating super soldiers for the Cold War. This defiance led to a second wave of professional isolation, where he was relegated to a small, poorly funded clinic on the outskirts of the city. Yet even there, the impossible continued to happen. Paralyzed patients regained movement, and those with autoimmune disorders saw their symptoms vanish, all through the quiet, diligent practice of the reduced breath. The doctor proved that integrity was as vital to healing as oxygen itself, and his refusal to compromise his ethics only added to his mystique among the urban populace. The legacy of the Siberian doctor is now being validated by modern neuroscience, which has finally discovered the respiratory pacemaker in the brain, a cluster of neurons that Buteyko instinctively understood back in the 1950s. We now know that the way we breathe directly wires into our fight or flight system, and Buteyko's method was essentially a manual override for the human stress response. In the glass and steel cities of today, where chronic stress is the leading cause of death, his unconventional Siberian methods look more like common sense than ever before. The impossible illnesses he cured were simply the body's way of screaming for a break from the relentless pace of modern life. By slowing down the breath, he was slowing down the soul, allowing the body's natural regenerative powers to take over and perform the miracles that the textbook said were impossible. Today, as you walk through any major city, you see the signs of the air hunger Buteyko warned about. People mouth-breathing on subways, gasping during light exercise, and snoring their way through restless nights. But the Siberian secret is no longer hidden behind the Iron Curtain. It is a tool available to anyone, anywhere, requiring no equipment and no cost, just the awareness of the air moving through your nose. Dr. Konstantin Buteyko's story is a reminder that sometimes the most profound medical breakthroughs don't come from a billionaire's lab, but from a lone doctor in a frozen city who was brave enough to tell the world that they were simply breathing too much. His life was a testament to the power of observation, the resilience of the human spirit, and the hidden potential locked within every single breath we take. Would you like me to create a detailed 30-day Siberian breathing challenge guide based on Buteyko's original protocols to help you start practicing these methods at home?